When did you find out that one deleted message is all it takes to lose someone forever? My brother Nathan sent me a voicemail at 3 in the morning on a Friday in October. I didn't listen to it. I was annoyed, actually, because his drinking had gotten worse over the past year, and his late-night calls were always the same rambling apologies about things that happened when we were kids. The notification sat there on my phone while I made coffee and got ready for work, and I remember thinking I'd deal with it later when I had the energy to hear him slur through another story about our father. By noon, I'd forgotten about it entirely. My phone storage was getting full anyway, so during my lunch break, I went through deleting old voicemails without listening to them. Nathan's message from that morning was one of them. I barely glanced at the timestamp before swiping it into the trash. 3 hours later, my sister Iris called me at work. Her voice so broken I could barely understand what she was saying. Nathan was dead. They found him in his apartment that afternoon when his boss went to check on him after he didn't show up for his shift at the warehouse. No signs of struggle, no note, just Nathan on his couch like he'd fallen asleep. The medical examiner would later say it was an overdose, accidental or intentional. They couldn't determine which. I stood in the parking lot of my office building with Iris crying on the phone, and my first thought was that voicemail, the one I'd deleted without listening. What if he'd said something important? What if there was a clue in his words that could have changed everything? I went straight to my deleted folder, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. 30 days. That's how long deleted voicemails stay retrievable. Except the folder was empty. I just cleared it that morning as part of my storage cleanup, permanently erasing everything including Nathan's final message to me. The weight of what I'd done hit me like a physical blow, and I bent over right there in the parking lot and threw up. My younger brother had reached out to me in what might have been his last hours alive, and I'd deleted him. I drove to Iris's house in a daze, barely remembering the route through suburban streets I'd traveled 1,000 times. She lived with her husband Kevin and their 2 kids in a modest home about 20 minutes from my apartment. When I got there, the house was full of relatives I hadn't seen in years, all of them crying and holding each other while I stood in the doorway feeling completely hollow. Our mother, Patricia, sat on the couch surrounded by photo albums, already deep into that grief-stricken nostalgia that overtakes people when someone dies suddenly. She kept saying Nathan had been doing so much better lately, that he'd sounded happy when they talked last week. I wanted to scream that I had no idea how he'd sounded because I'd thrown away his last words without even the basic courtesy of listening. Kevin pulled me aside into the kitchen and explained what little they knew. Nathan's boss, a man named Gregory, had gotten worried when Nathan didn't show up for the morning shift. Nathan had been reliable for the past 6 months, never missing a day, which was why Gregory drove to his apartment instead of just calling. The door was unlocked, and Nathan was on the couch with an empty bottle of pills on the coffee table next to him. The police said it looked like he'd been there for several hours, which meant he probably died not long after leaving me that voicemail. The thought made my legs weak, and I had to sit down at the kitchen table, putting my head in my hands while Kevin talked about funeral arrangements and notifying extended family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment in my car when I'd casually deleted Nathan's message, treating it like junk mail instead of a communication from my own brother. What had he wanted to tell me? Was it a goodbye? A cry for help? Just another drunk rambling that happened to be his last? The not knowing felt like it was eating me alive from the inside out. Around 2 in the morning, I remembered that my phone carrier might keep records of voicemail transcriptions. I'd signed up for the service years ago and forgotten about it, but maybe, just maybe, there was a backup somewhere. I spent the next 3 hours on my laptop, logging into every account I could think of, searching through emails and cloud storage for any trace of that message. Nothing. The transcription service had been discontinued 6 months ago, and all old data had been purged from their servers. I was staring at my computer screen when dawn broke, feeling more hopeless than I'd ever felt in my life. The funeral was scheduled for the following Thursday, at a small chapel our family had used for generations. I spent the days leading up to it in a fog, going through the motions at work while my mind churned endlessly over that deleted voicemail. My boss, a usually understanding woman named Margaret, finally pulled me aside on Wednesday and told me to take the rest of the week off. She could see I wasn't functioning, and honestly, I was grateful for the permission to fall apart. I went home and sat in my apartment, staring at my phone like it might spontaneously resurrect Nathan's message if I wished hard enough. That evening, Iris called asking if I'd help her go through Nathan's apartment before the landlord cleared it out. The police had finished their investigation and released the scene, but none of us had the emotional strength to face his belongings yet. I agreed immediately, thinking maybe I'd find something there that would give me closure about what he'd been thinking that night. We met at Nathan's place the next morning, a shabby studio apartment in a building that had seen better days. Walking into Nathan's space felt like violating a tomb. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, including a half-empty beer on the side table and his laptop open on the kitchen counter. Iris started with the bedroom area, sorting clothes and personal items while I gravitated toward his desk, where bills and papers were scattered in chaotic piles. Nathan had never been organized, and sorting through his stuff felt like archaeology, uncovering layers of his life I'd known nothing about. There were past due notices for utilities, printed job applications for positions he'd never mentioned, and a journal I didn't even know he kept. I picked up the journal with trembling hands and flipped it open to a random page from 3 weeks ago. Nathan's handwriting was barely legible, but I could make out phrases about feeling trapped and wondering if anyone would notice if he disappeared. The entries went back months, documenting a spiral of depression and isolation that none of us had recognized. I kept reading, my heart sinking deeper with every page until I reached the final entry dated the night he died. The last thing Nathan wrote was a simple sentence. Called Theo. Hope he picks up this time. My name on the page in his handwriting felt like an accusation. He'd been reaching out and I'd ignored him. Not just that final night, but apparently multiple times before. I flipped back through earlier entries and found other mentions of calls I didn't remember. Texts I must have read and forgotten to answer. Invitations to hang out that I'd been too busy to accept. The pattern was there in black ink. A documentation of my failures as a brother spread across months of pages. I'd been so wrapped up in my own life, my career and my routine and my carefully managed schedule that I'd let Nathan slip through the cracks. Iris found me sitting on the floor with the journal open in my lap, tears running down my face while I read about how lonely Nathan had felt. She knelt down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders, and when she saw what I was reading, she started crying too. Neither of us had been there for him the way we should have been, but somehow my guilt felt heavier because I had that deleted voicemail hanging over me like a curse. We spent hours in that apartment, boxing up Nathan's life into containers that would be distributed among family or donated to charity. In his closet, I found a shoebox full of old photographs from our childhood, back when our father was still alive and our family felt intact. There was Nathan at maybe 8 years old, grinning with missing front teeth while I stood next to him looking serious and responsible even then. Other photos showed family vacations and birthday parties, moments of happiness that seemed impossible given how everything turned out. Our father had died when Nathan was 16, and looking back now, I could see that was when things started going wrong for him. He'd never processed that grief properly, just buried it under substances and bad decisions until it finally consumed him completely. I put the photos in my bag to keep, feeling like I needed to hold on to some evidence that Nathan had once been happy. As we were finishing up, I checked Nathan's laptop one more time, opening his email to see if there was anything that might explain his state of mind. Most of it was spam and promotional messages, but buried in his sent folder from that final night, I found something that made my blood run cold. Nathan had sent an email to himself at 3:15 in the morning, just minutes after leaving me that voicemail. The subject line was, "In case I don't make it," and the body of the email was a long, rambling message that was clearly written while he was intoxicated, but trying to be coherent. He wrote about feeling like he'd wasted his life and let everyone down, about the constant weight of depression that he couldn't shake no matter what he tried. He mentioned our father and how he'd never lived up to the example that had been set, how he knew everyone in the family viewed him as the failure and the problem. Then, near the end of the message, he wrote about calling me. He said he'd tried to explain everything in the voicemail, tried to tell me what he was planning, but he knew I probably wouldn't listen because I never did anymore. The casual acceptance of my rejection, written in his own words, absolutely destroyed me. I read that email 3 times before Iris noticed I'd gone completely still and came over to see what I'd found. When she read it over my shoulder, she grabbed the laptop and kept scrolling, finding more draft emails Nathan had written but never sent. There were messages to our mother, to Iris, to old friends and former girlfriends, all of them saying goodbye in different ways. Some were angry, some were sad, some were almost hopeful, like he thought maybe dying would be better than continuing to live the way he had been. Iris and I sat there reading Nathan's final thoughts, and with each new revelation, the weight of guilt became more unbearable. He'd been planning this for a while, or at least thinking about it seriously enough to document his intentions. The email to himself was like a backup plan, insurance that someone would eventually understand what he'd been going through, even if nobody listened while he was alive. I thought about that deleted voicemail again, wondering if hearing it would have changed anything. Would I have recognized the desperation in his voice? Would I have dropped everything and driven to his apartment to check on him? Or would I have done what I'd been doing for months and dismissed it as another drunk episode, promising myself I'd deal with it later when it was more convenient? The honest answer was that I probably wouldn't have listened anyway, and that realization was almost worse than the deletion itself. We left Nathan's apartment as the sun was setting, carrying boxes of his belongings to load into Iris's van. His landlord, an elderly man named Walter, was waiting by the entrance and asked how we were holding up. When we said we were managing, he mentioned that Nathan had been a quiet tenant, always paid his rent on time the last few months, seemed like he was finally getting his life together. The disconnect between how Nathan appeared to others and what he was actually going through struck me hard. He'd been good at hiding his pain, putting on a functional mask while dying inside, and none of us had looked closely enough to see through it. Walter handed us Nathan's security deposit refund and said he was sorry for our loss, then shuffled back to his own unit, leaving us alone in the parking lot. Iris suggested we get dinner before heading home, neither of us ready to face our respective households yet, so we drove to a quiet diner and sat in a corner booth picking at food neither of us wanted. That's when she finally asked me what I'd been dreading. She wanted to know if Nathan had said anything specific in that voicemail I'd mentioned to her earlier. I had to tell her the truth. I explained how I'd deleted it without listening, how I'd cleared my trash folder that same morning, making it permanently unrecoverable. Iris's face went through several emotions, shock and anger and grief all competing for dominance, before settling into a kind of resigned sadness. She said she understood because she'd done similar things, ignored Nathan's calls when she was busy with her kids, made excuses about why she couldn't meet up with him when he asked. We'd all failed him in our own ways, she said, but we couldn't change that now. All we could do was make sure we learned from it and didn't make the same mistakes with other people we loved. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they felt hollow, like trying to put a band-aid on an amputation. Nothing could fix what I'd done or bring back that message. I would spend the rest of my life wondering what Nathan had said, what his voice sounded like in those final hours, whether there was love or blame or just exhaustion in his tone. The not knowing would haunt me forever, a permanent reminder of how casually we can throw away the things that matter most. The funeral service was exactly what you'd expect, a small gathering of family and a few of Nathan's co-workers who felt obligated to attend. Our pastor, an older man who'd known Nathan since he was a child, gave a generic eulogy about life being precious and cherishing every moment. I sat in the front pew next to our mother, who cried steadily through the entire service, and thought about how none of these platitudes addressed the real tragedy. Nathan hadn't died in some unavoidable accident or from an illness beyond his control. He died because he was suffering, and nobody, including me especially, had paid enough attention to help him. After the service, people lined up to offer condolences and share their memories of Nathan, most of them stories from years ago when he'd been different. His boss, Gregory, approached me and said Nathan had mentioned me several times at work, always talking about how I was the successful brother who had everything figured out. Apparently, Nathan had been proud of me even while struggling himself, which made me feel even worse. I thanked Gregory for coming and excused myself to the bathroom, where I locked myself in a stall and finally let myself completely fall apart. In the weeks after the funeral, I became obsessed with trying to reconstruct what Nathan might have said in that voicemail. I called my phone carrier multiple times, speaking to different representatives and supervisors, begging them to search their backup systems for any trace of the deleted message. Each call ended the same way, with a polite but firm explanation that once something was permanently deleted from my device and their servers, it was gone forever. I tried third-party data recovery services, sent my phone to specialists who charged hundreds of dollars to tell me what I already knew, that the data was unrecoverable. My apartment became filled with printouts of Nathan's journal entries and emails, which I read obsessively looking for clues about his final state of mind. I stopped going to work consistently, my performance slipping until Margaret called me in for a serious conversation about whether I was capable of continuing in my position. I told her I needed more time, that I was dealing with complicated grief, but the truth was, I was spiraling in ways that probably mirrored how Nathan had felt before he died. Iris started checking on me more frequently, stopping by my apartment unannounced to make sure I was eating and functioning. She'd find me surrounded by Nathan's belongings, his journal open on my coffee table while I sat staring at my phone, willing it to somehow produce that voicemail. She tried to get me to see a therapist, even went so far as to make appointments for me that I promptly canceled. I didn't want to talk about my feelings with a stranger. I wanted that message back. I wanted to hear Nathan's voice one more time and know exactly what he'd tried to tell me. Everything else felt pointless compared to that single need. One evening about 6 weeks after Nathan's death, Iris showed up with her husband Kevin, and they staged what amounted to an intervention. They sat me down and explained, kindly but firmly, that I was destroying myself over something I couldn't change. Kevin, who worked in IT, had even consulted with colleagues about data recovery and confirmed there was absolutely no way to retrieve that voicemail. It was gone, Kevin said, and continuing to search for it was only preventing me from actually grieving and processing Nathan's death. I didn't want to hear it, but they wouldn't leave until I agreed to at least try therapy. Iris made me promise I'd go to one session with a grief counselor she'd found, someone who specialized in complicated bereavement and survivor's guilt. I agreed just to get them to leave, not actually planning to follow through, but Iris called the next morning to confirm I hadn't canceled the appointment. The counselor's name was Dr. Helen Pritchard, and her office was in a professional building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and artificial flowers. I sat in her waiting room feeling like I was wasting my time, but when she called me back to her office, something about her direct manner made me actually want to talk. She didn't offer me tissues or speak in that soft, therapeutic voice that some counselors use. She just asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I found myself explaining everything from the deleted voicemail to Nathan's journal to my obsessive attempts at recovery. Dr. Pritchard listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, and when I finished, she said something I wasn't expecting. She told me that fixating on the voicemail was a way of avoiding the deeper grief underneath. As long as I was focused on recovering that message, I didn't have to face the reality that Nathan was gone, and nothing could bring him back. The voicemail had become a kind of talisman, a symbol of all the ways I'd failed Nathan, and I'd convinced myself that hearing it would provide some kind of absolution or closure. But Dr. Pritchard said that even if I'd listened to that message when it first came in, it might not have changed anything. Nathan's problems were bigger than one phone call, bigger than anything I could have fixed in a single conversation. She asked me to consider what I was really mourning, the loss of Nathan, or the loss of my own sense of control. The question hit me like a slap because she was right. I'd spent my whole life being the responsible older brother, the one who had it all together, and Nathan's death shattered that illusion. I couldn't protect him, couldn't save him, couldn't even be bothered to listen when he reached out. That failure had broken something fundamental in how I saw myself. Over the next several months, I saw Dr. Pritchard weekly, slowly working through the layers of grief and guilt that had consumed me. She helped me understand that survivor's guilt was normal, especially when someone dies by suicide or overdose, and that the what-ifs would probably never completely go away. But she also taught me that I could carry those questions without letting them destroy me, that it was possible to honor Nathan's memory without drowning in regret. We talked about the pattern of distance that had developed between us, How it hadn't started with that deleted voicemail but had been building for years. I'd been pulling away from Nathan long before his final night, uncomfortable with his drinking and his instability, preferring to keep my own life neat and separate from his chaos. The voicemail was just the final manifestation of a choice I'd been making repeatedly to prioritize my comfort over his need for connection. Dr. Pritchard pushed me to examine why I'd made those choices, what fears or judgments had driven me to maintain that distance, and slowly I started to see how my own issues with control and perfection had contributed to our fractured relationship. Around the 6-month mark after Nathan's death, I finally felt ready to go through the boxes of his belongings that had been sitting in my closet untouched. Iris came over to help, and we spent an afternoon sorting through his clothes and books and random possessions, deciding what to keep and what to donate. At the bottom of one box, wrapped in an old t-shirt, I found Nathan's phone. It had been dead when the police found him, and I'd forgotten it was even in the stuff we'd taken from his apartment. Iris plugged it in and we waited while it slowly charged, neither of us sure what we'd find, but both feeling like we needed to look. When it finally powered on, there were dozens of unread notifications, including several missed calls from me in the days after he died before I'd known what happened. His photo gallery was full of random screenshots and memes, nothing particularly meaningful, but then Iris found his voice memo app. There were only 3 recordings, all from that final night, and my hands started shaking as she pressed play on the first one. Nathan's voice filled my apartment, slurred and emotional, talking to himself about everything he was feeling. The first recording was over 10 minutes long, a rambling stream of consciousness about his regrets and his pain and his exhaustion with trying to keep going. He talked about our father and how he'd never gotten over losing him, about feeling like a disappointment to everyone in the family, about being tired of pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. Then he mentioned calling me, said he was going to try one more time to reach out, to tell someone what he was planning. The recording ended abruptly, and the second one picked up a few minutes later, this time with Nathan sounding more focused. He said he'd left me a voicemail explaining everything, that I probably wouldn't listen, but at least he'd tried. He hoped I wouldn't blame myself because this wasn't anyone's fault except his own. The words were meant to be comforting, but they had the opposite effect, making me feel even more guilty for not answering his call. The third recording was just 30 seconds long, Nathan saying goodbye to no one in particular, and then the sound of him setting the phone down. Iris and I sat there in silence after the recordings ended, both of us crying. These voice memos weren't the same as the voicemail he'd left me, but they gave us insight into what he'd been thinking, what his state of mind had been during those final hours. He'd been drunk, but not incoherent, sad, but not irrational, clearly planning what he was about to do while simultaneously reaching out for help. The contradiction was heartbreaking. Part of him had wanted to be saved, and part of him had wanted it all to end, and somehow the latter won out. I asked Iris if she thought hearing these earlier would have changed anything, and she said probably not. Nathan's problems had been building for years, and one intervention, even if perfectly timed, might not have been enough to pull him back from the edge he'd already fallen over. But she also said it mattered that we tried now to understand what he'd been going through, that we honored his memory by actually listening even if it was too late to help. We made copies of the voice memos, and I kept them on my phone, listening to them occasionally when I needed to feel connected to Nathan or when the guilt became overwhelming. Dr. Pritchard's response when I told her about finding the recordings was measured. She said they might provide some closure, but could also become another thing I fixated on, another way of avoiding present grief by staying stuck in the past. She encouraged me to listen if I needed to, but not to let the recordings replace the actual work of processing Nathan's death and my complicated feelings about it. Her guidance helped me maintain some balance, and over time, I found I needed to listen less frequently as I slowly made peace with what happened. I returned to work full-time after negotiating a reduced schedule with Margaret, who'd been surprisingly understanding about my extended difficulties. My performance never quite reached previous levels, but I was functional again, able to focus on tasks without constantly spiraling into thoughts about deleted voicemails and missed opportunities. Iris and I grew closer through our shared grief, making a point to have dinner together weekly and actually talk about how we were doing instead of just exchanging pleasantries. On the 1-year anniversary of Nathan's death, our family held a small memorial at his grave. We each brought something to share, stories or photos or items that reminded us of him. I brought a printed copy of his journal entries along with a letter I'd written explaining everything I wished I'd said to him while he was alive. Dr. Pritchard had suggested the letter as an exercise in expressing unspoken feelings, and reading it aloud at the grave felt like a small act of closure. I apologized for the distance I'd maintained, for the calls I didn't answer and the time I didn't make, for deleting his final message without listening. I told him I understood now that he'd been hurting far worse than any of us realized, and that I was sorry we couldn't help him carry that weight. The words felt inadequate but necessary, and when I finished reading, Iris put her arm around me and said Nathan would have appreciated me trying. Our mother, who'd been quieter this past year as she dealt with her own grief, added that Nathan had always looked up to me despite everything, and that he would want me to forgive myself eventually. The question of what was actually in that deleted voicemail still haunts me sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep, and my mind wanders to dark places. I've constructed dozens of possibilities over the past year, imagining everything from a desperate cry for help to a calm goodbye to an angry accusation. The voice memos from his phone gave me some context, but they weren't addressed to me specifically, weren't the actual words Nathan chose to say when he called my number that final time. That gap in knowledge is something I've learned to live with, a permanent question mark that reminds me how fragile our connections are and how easily we can lose people through casual neglect. Dr. Pritchard says the not knowing might actually be a gift in disguise, because whatever I imagine the voicemail contained will never be as complicated or as painful as the reality probably was. Sometimes our minds need mysteries to protect us from truths we can't handle, and maybe that's what the deletion provided, a mercy I didn't know I was giving myself. These days I'm more careful about staying connected to the people I love. I answer calls even when it's inconvenient. I respond to texts promptly instead of letting them pile up. I make time for coffee or dinner when someone reaches out. It's a conscious effort to push back against my natural tendency toward isolation and control, to remain engaged even when it's uncomfortable. Iris notices the change and comments on it sometimes, saying I've become a better brother to her in death than I ever was to Nathan in life. The observation stings, but it's accurate. I'm trying to learn from my failures, to make sure Nathan's death counts for something beyond just grief and regret. I've started volunteering at a crisis hotline once a week, answering calls from people who are struggling and need someone to listen. It doesn't erase what I did or didn't do for Nathan, but it helps me feel like I'm honoring his memory in some small way. The hardest part isn't the big moments like anniversaries or holidays. It's the random Tuesdays when something reminds me of Nathan, and I instinctively reach for my phone to call him before remembering he's gone. Or when I see someone who looks like him from behind and my heart jumps before reality crashes back in. Grief isn't linear despite what people say, and some days the weight of that deleted voicemail feels as heavy as it did the day I realized what I'd done. But most days now I can carry it without being crushed, can acknowledge the loss without letting it consume me entirely. Dr. Pritchard says that's progress, that learning to hold space for both the grief and the rest of life is what healing actually looks like. I'm not sure I'll ever fully heal from losing Nathan the way I did, but I'm learning to exist alongside the pain instead of being destroyed by it. And maybe that's the best any of us can hope for when we lose someone to their own demons and our own failures combined. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.